For decades, Jerry Lewis was known as the king of comedy, the man whose energy, wit, and wild humor defined an entire era of entertainment. But behind the slapstick genius and the million-dollar smile was a man whose private life was filled with tension, ego, and bitterness. To the world, Jerry was a comedic icon, but to those who truly knew him, he was also a man who carried grudges that never faded. He worked with Hollywood's biggest names, from Dean Martin to Frank Sinatra. Yet there was one person Jerry Lewis could never forgive. Someone who pushed him to the edge of his patience, tested his pride, and became the one man he truly hated more than anyone else in show business. Over the years, Lewis made no secret of his rivalries. His sharp tongue and blunt honesty left reporters stunned, co-stars alienated, and producers walking on eggshells. But there was one feud that burned brighter and darker than all the rest. It wasn't just jealousy or creative differences. It was personal, deeply personal, a betrayal that Jerry Lewis would never recover from, even decades later. What really happened between Jerry and the man he despised most? What fueled that lifelong resentment? And how did it shape the final years of his legendary career? Stay tuned, because this is the untold story of Jerry Lewis, the genius, the legend, and the grudge that never died. Before Jerry Lewis became the iconic face of American comedy, he was just a young boy from Newark, New Jersey. Born Joseph Levitch in 1926, his parents were vaudeville performers, and from the very start, show business was in his blood. He grew up backstage, watching his mother sing and his father tell jokes, learning early on how an audience could be moved from silence to laughter with just a glance or a line. But what few people realized was that behind the scenes, Jerry was also learning how fleeting fame could be, how quickly applause could turn into indifference. In his teenage years, Jerry developed his own act, a chaotic blend of slapstick, pantomime, and over-the-top energy that would one day define his entire career. He called it record act, miming exaggeratedly to music, while twisting his face and body in ways that made crowds roar. By 1945, he was performing at small clubs around New York when fate intervened. That same year, he met a smooth, charming nightclub singer named Dean Martin. Their chemistry was instant. Dean's cool, effortless charm was the perfect counterbalance to Jerry's manic, childlike energy. Together, they became The Martin and Lewis Show, a comedy duo unlike anything audiences had ever seen. By the late 1940s, they were headlining the Copacabana, making radio appearances, and soon starring in blockbuster films for Paramount Pictures. But with fame came friction. While the public adored their partnership, Jerry's ambition began to outgrow the act. He wanted more control, more say in scripts, camera angles, and direction. Dean, on the other hand, was growing tired of playing the straight man, the one who simply stood by while Jerry got all the laughs. Their success became a double-edged sword, sharpening both their careers and their resentment. Behind closed doors, Jerry often took credit for their creative success. In interviews, he would boast about writing routines or directing scenes, things Dean quietly disagreed with. Hollywood insiders began to whisper that their friendship had become a silent rivalry. The smiles on screen were hiding mounting tension off-screen. By 1956, after a decade of superstardom, the duo split. Their final performance at the Copacabana ended with a forced hug and tears in front of a stunned audience. After that night, they didn't speak for 20 years. Jerry later admitted that the breakup left him emotionally shattered, but it also marked the beginning of his solo dominance. Freed from the duo, Jerry became a creative powerhouse. He directed, wrote, and starred in a string of successful films including The Bellboy, The Nutty Professor, and The Ladies' Man. He was hailed as a genius, a pioneer of comedy, and one of the first to use video assist technology in filmmaking. However, That same genius came with a sharp edge. Jerry was demanding, controlling, and quick-tempered. Co-stars described him as brilliant but difficult, a man obsessed with perfection and allergic to criticism. He was fiercely proud of his work and fiercely protective of his reputation. And it was that pride, that intensity, that would eventually ignite a feud so personal it would haunt him for decades. Because one man in Hollywood would cross Jerry Lewis in a way that went beyond competition. It went straight to betrayal. And from that moment on, Jerry Lewis would carry that hatred with him until the end. After the breakup with Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis's solo career skyrocketed. He became a household name, an unstoppable comedic force whose films drew audiences in the millions. Yet, with his success came new rivals, but none as personal or as bitter as the man who would become the center of his lifelong hatred. This man was none other than Milton Berle, the Mr. Television himself, a performer who dominated early TV and was revered for his quick wit and influential presence in Hollywood. On paper, Berle and Lewis had everything in common. Both were comedic geniuses, both were ambitious, and both craved attention and respect. But where Jerry had warmth and charm, Milton had ego and territorial instincts. And Hollywood, as always, loves a collision of titans. The feud started quietly. In the late 1950s, Jerry's films and TV appearances were drawing record audiences. Critics praised his creativity and slapstick genius, often comparing him favorably to established stars. Berle, long accustomed to being the king of comedy, did not take kindly to someone younger, more innovative, and rapidly surpassing him. Rumors spread that Berle tried to block certain of Jerry's projects, influencing studio executives and even threatening collaborators who wanted to work with Lewis. Jerry, already fiercely protective of his craft, saw this as a personal attack. "I wasn't just competing for laughs," he later said in interviews. "This was about respect, about being recognized for the work I poured my soul into. It wasn't just professional rivalry. It was ego, betrayal, and pride colliding in a way that left deep emotional scars." Their public interactions were tense but polite, a veneer of civility covering an undercurrent of loathing. Yet behind the scenes, the feud intensified. Jerry would often vent to close friends about Berle, describing him as manipulative, arrogant, and impossible to work with. Colleagues recalled Jerry saying that Berle crossed every line and that he would never forgive him. As the 1960s progressed, the rivalry became a point of fascination in Hollywood gossip columns. Writers speculated that Berle's interference had cost Jerry certain roles or opportunities, although nothing was ever confirmed. Still, the animosity was clear, simmering beneath the surface, spilling over into interviews and personal anecdotes. Jerry even admitted decades later that the feud haunted him more than any other incident in his career. While other actors and comedians came and went, Berle remained the one figure Jerry could never reconcile with. Even after years had passed, when Lewis was celebrated for his lifetime achievements, his awards, and his philanthropic work, Berle remained a shadow over his legacy. The resentment was not petty or fleeting. It was deep, ingrained, and personal. It's important to understand that for Jerry, comedy was sacred. To have someone he perceived as trying to undermine or diminish that artistry was unforgivable. In his mind, Berle wasn't just a competitor. He was a threat to everything Jerry had worked tirelessly to achieve. And it wasn't just about ego. It was about the principle of fairness, recognition, and respect, in a world where both were often in short supply. Friends and biographers note that this intense hatred shaped much of Jerry's later life. It affected the way he approached collaborations, interviews, and even friendships in Hollywood. He became more guarded, more selective, and less willing to trust others, knowing that behind every smile there could be ambition or envy lurking. By the end of his career, Jerry Lewis had made peace with most of his past rivalries, but not Milton Berle. Even decades later, Lewis described him as the one I never forgot, the one I never forgave. It was a lifelong grudge that defined part of the man behind the laughter, showing that even the brightest comedic genius can harbor shadows from unresolved battles. Jerry Lewis wasn't just a comedian. He was a visionary, a performer who redefined what it meant to make people laugh. Yet, behind the accolades, the awards, and the worldwide recognition, his lifelong feud with Milton Berle cast a shadow over much of his personal and professional life. For Jerry, comedy was more than entertainment. It was an art form, a discipline, and a sacred responsibility. Every gesture, every facial expression, every perfectly timed pause carried meaning. To have someone he perceived as attempting to undermine or steal credit from him wasn't merely irritating. It felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. Berle's interference, real or imagined, became a symbol of Hollywood's darker side. The envy, the sabotage, and the cutthroat competition that could destroy careers and crush spirits. Friends of Jerry recalled how the feud influenced his interactions in the industry. He became cautious and guarded, selective about who he worked with and which projects he accepted. Producers noticed that he was more insistent on creative control, sometimes clashing with studios who questioned his methods or ideas. While some interpreted this as ego or arrogance, those who knew him best understood it as a protective measure. After all, once bitten, twice shy. Jerry's experiences with Berle had left a deep impression. Trust had to be earned, not freely given. The rivalry also shaped his approach to mentorship and collaborations. Jerry took young comedians under his wing, guiding them while cautioning them about the pitfalls of Hollywood. "The business will try to chew you up if you're not careful," he would warn. "Protect your work, protect your ideas, and never forget who's been real with you." Behind this advice lay the lessons he'd learned from bitter experience, and from one particularly painful relationship that never healed. Despite the bitterness, the feud inadvertently fueled some of Jerry's most creative moments. Channeling anger and frustration into his craft, he became even more meticulous and inventive. Films like The Nutty Professor and The Bellboy weren't just comedies. They were testaments to his ingenuity and resilience. Every frame reflected the precision and control that Jerry demanded, a silent declaration that no rival could overshadow him. Yet, even as his career soared, Jerry carried the grudge with him. He avoided public appearances with Berle, declined invitations to reunions, and often refused to speak about him in interviews. The hatred became almost a private companion, a constant reminder of his battles and the price of success in an unforgiving industry. Still, Jerry Lewis's legacy is undeniable. He brought joy to millions, revolutionized comedy, and dedicated himself to philanthropic work, particularly with the Muscular Dystrophy Association. He showed the world that laughter could heal, connect, and endure. Yet, the feud with Berle reveals a deeper truth. Behind every icon is a human being shaped not only by triumphs, but by conflicts, betrayals, and unresolved tensions. In the end, Jerry Lewis was a man of contrasts, hilarious yet serious, tender yet stubborn, loved by millions yet carrying a grudge that never faded. That hatred, far from diminishing his brilliance, became a defining aspect of his life, shaping the way he approached art, trust, and legacy. Even after his passing in 2017, those who study his career note that the story of Jerry and Berle serves as a cautionary tale, that behind the laughter of a genius sometimes lies a lifetime of hidden battles. By the time Jerry Lewis reached the pinnacle of his career, he was admired worldwide for his genius in comedy, his energy, and his relentless drive. Yet, beneath the spotlight, one feud defined a shadowy corner of his life: his deep-seated hatred for Milton Berle. To the public, this may have seemed like a typical Hollywood rivalry, but for Jerry, it was intensely personal, shaping decisions, relationships, and even his approach to his art. The root of the feud was more than professional jealousy. Colleagues Biographies suggest it was sparked by a perceived betrayal during the early years of television. Jerry often felt that Berle, who wielded enormous influence as a TV pioneer, had actively attempted to undermine him. Whether it was in meetings with studio executives, behind-the-scenes manipulations, or spreading damaging gossip, Jerry believed Berle tried to block his rise. In a business where reputation and timing were everything, this was a wound that refused to heal. What made it even more painful for Jerry was the timing. He had just separated from Dean Martin and was trying to solidify his solo career. Every obstacle, every slight, every rumor that he attributed to Berle seemed like an attack not just on his work, but on his very identity as a performer. Friends recalled Jerry saying, "You can't imagine what it feels like when someone tries to steal not just your work, but your heart for it. I never forgot, and I never forgave." This personal animosity impacted Jerry's choices. He avoided collaborative projects with Berle and anyone associated with him. Invitations to joint appearances, comedy events, and award shows were politely declined. Interviews were carefully controlled, ensuring the story of Berle's interference remained in the background, acknowledged only when necessary. Even as he aged and Hollywood changed around him, Jerry never softened. To him, some lines could never be crossed, and some wounds never healed. Yet, paradoxically, this hatred also fueled his brilliance. Jerry poured his energy into perfecting his craft. Movies like The Nutty Professor, The Bellboy, and Cinderfella were marked by meticulous attention to detail, inventive slapstick, and performances that only someone driven by a mix of genius and stubbornness could achieve. In private conversations, colleagues admitted that his perfectionism was directly tied to his desire to prove himself, to show the world that no rival could diminish his talent. The feud also taught Jerry a harsh lesson about trust and loyalty in Hollywood. He became more discerning, surrounding himself only with people he could truly rely on. While some saw this as a flaw, a paranoia born of pride, others recognized it as survival in a cutthroat industry. His mentorship of younger comedians, then, wasn't just about teaching comedy. It was about teaching them to protect their craft, to recognize envy, and to never allow someone else to define their worth. In the end, Jerry Lewis's hatred for Milton Berle was a paradoxical element of his legacy. It was a reminder that even the most brilliant artists carry private battles and grudges. But it also illuminated the fire behind his genius, the relentless drive that allowed him to entertain millions while navigating the treacherous waters of Hollywood. Jerry passed away in 2017, but the story of his rivalry remains. It is a testament to the complexities of fame, the consequences of ambition, and the enduring human emotions that can shape even the greatest legends. His laughter, his films, and his devotion to his craft endure. But behind them lies the untold truth, that sometimes even a comedic genius carries grudges that define them just as much as their talent does.